This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 669 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. We made it. It's week 1, which means you're about to hear the same rotation of episodes each week on this show. Tuesday is 15 Transactions Day. That's what this episode is. For those of you who are newer to the show, 15 Transactions started all the way back in 2013. I wrote a column each week on players to buy, sell, add, and drop, and I sort of treated it as my fantasy football brain dump. And I still do. It's sort of the place where I put a ton of different thoughts together on the fantasy football landscape as a whole. And make no mistake, I'm going to be wrong about the things that I talk about on this episode each week. That's what happens with fantasy football analysis. You get things wrong. I'm not just concerned about being right or being wrong. I'm concerned about being helpful. I want to get your mind thinking about things in different ways to help you win a fantasy football championship. You don't have to take action on these transactions. In fact, you probably won't for a lot of them. But hearing the process and why I feel the way that I do about these players, that can often help you shape your own process when you're evaluating players in season. Now, I used to write my 15 transactions article over on numberfire.com, but I'm no longer a FanDuel and Numberfire employee. So the article itself will be emailed out every Tuesday morning to Late Round Fantasy Football newsletter subscribers. If you like reading alongside this podcast, you can subscribe for absolutely free over on lateround.com. I'm really just going over that article on this show each week. But with the podcast, I'm able to give you a little bit more context. But make sure you're subscribed by going to lateround.com. And if you're not receiving the emails, check your spam or junk folders because they might be landing there. Now, before getting into the transactions this week, I have a question to ask you guys. Do you need more smart football content? If so, my friend and trusted analyst Ed Fang is one of the best at applying analytics to football betting. On his podcast, The Football Analytics Show, he has his 2022 preview series. They're solo episodes like you hear from me on this podcast. He also interviews the sharpest minds in football betting. So check out The Football Analytics Show wherever you get your podcasts. Also, with the 2022 NFL season nearly underway, FanDuel and GMC are back to bring you the GMC Sierra Mountain Climber Pick'em, a free-to-play contest series that gives you a chance to win a share of $10,000 in FanDuel site credit every Sunday, courtesy of GMC. Here's how it works. Every Sunday during the NFL season, you'll have a chance to answer questions based on the day's non-primetime games. The more questions you answer correctly, the higher up the mountain you'll move. If during any week you answer every question correctly for a perfect score, you'll reach the summit and you'll win your share of $10,000 in site credit. The contest series is now live, so head to fanduel.com/free/contest/GMC to start climbing the mountain. Buy Trey Lance. I talked about this in the mailbag episode last week, but I think a lot of fantasy managers are nervous about Jimmy Garoppolo sticking in San Francisco. I'm not as nervous. Yes, we might see a slightly shorter leash for Trey Lance, given what Jimmy G has done in that offense. But when Trey Lance is playing, he's more than likely going to be very good in fantasy football. In 2 starts last year, he scored 14.6 and 19.1 fantasy points. In one of those games, he was about an inch away from scoring a rushing touchdown. He ran the ball 24 times during those 2 starts. That's a number that's higher than Lamar Jackson's average rushes per game since he became starter. I'm not suggesting that Lance is going to be a bigger threat on the ground than Lamar Jackson. I'm just saying that the rushing component is absolutely there for Trey Lance. And we know that we want that in fantasy football. And the system is there too. Jimmy Garoppolo, a guy that no one wanted throughout the NFL, had the second highest yards per attempt rate last year. It's a good scheme, and they have very good weapons. And the other thing about Trey Lance, his schedule is nice in weeks 1 and 2. They're facing Pro Football Focus's preseason ranked 32nd and 30th pass defenses. And according to FanDuel Sportsbook, the 49ers have a top half team total across weeks 1 and 2. So I think that Lance is going to get off to a pretty good start. And we know that he has the upside to be a very, very good fantasy quarterback this year. If Jimmy Garoppolo is the reason that you don't want Trey Lance, then you probably don't want Trey Lance because you don't think he's going to be very good, which is totally fine, but I think that the upside is worth it. Sell David Montgomery. So look, if you've read the late round draft guide, if you've listened to this podcast throughout the offseason, then you already know that I haven't been drafting David Montgomery. I'm not the biggest David Montgomery fan this year. It's not that I think that he's bad. I just think the market is making a lot of assumptions for him. He ranked first in running back snap share 2 years ago, and he was second last year behind only Najee Harris. You might be sitting there and saying, oh, that's a great thing. Snaps correlate to fantasy success, which they do. But the problem is the only way to go for Montgomery is down. Why should we assume he's going to maintain that snap share? You have a completely new system in Chicago. You have a completely new coaching staff. And Khalil Herbert, his backup, was awesome last year. He gained 20 plus yards on the ground at a better rate than Montgomery, and he had a better success rate too. And now there's speculation that Herbert could end up being the lead back by the end of the year given this scheme. I can't even disagree with that. I think Khalil Herbert is very, very good. And then to make things even worse for David Montgomery, in weeks 1 and 2, the Bears get San Francisco and then they get Green Bay. According to FanDuel Sportsbook's lines, the Bears are 15-point underdogs in total during those 2 games. That's the third highest or third worst mark in the league. So they're expected to lose those games. That means that game script would not favor David Montgomery, which means he might not get off to a hot start. So I'm not really into David Montgomery in the short term or the long term this year. Add Kenyon Drake and Mike Davis. So we had these backfield injuries in Baltimore last year, and they've now trickled in to this season. Gus Edwards on the PUP, and J.K. Dobbins might not play in week 1. His availability is up in the air. Next in line for Baltimore, you have Mike Davis and the newly acquired Kenyon Drake. I would assume that Mike Davis gets the most work on the ground in week 1 if J.K. Dobbins is sidelined. I wouldn't be surprised if Davis saw the most work even if J.K. Dobbins is active. He's the one who's been around all summer in this offense. Kenyon Drake just joined last week. And the thing is, in week 1, Baltimore gets the Jets. It has a chance to be the Mike Davis show. Because if Baltimore gets out to a comfortable lead, which is very possible given their 6.5-point favorites, Mike Davis could see a lot of work. So Davis is a worthy pickup, but I do think that longer term, Kenyon Drake is the better player. So you can still add Kenyon Drake, and maybe he gets thrown in there in a rotation with Dobbins this year. Because I do think he's the second best running back on that roster, given the fact that Gus Edwards is still banged up. Hold Antonio Gibson. So again, like David Montgomery, Antonio Gibson is someone that I haven't been drafting this season. You guys know that. And it's because the Commanders have been telling us with their actions and their words that Antonio Gibson is not going to be their bell cow back. They re-signed J.D. McKissick. They drafted Brian Robinson on day 2. They openly talked about this backfield being a committee. And I talked about this on last week's mailbag show as well. It seems like the fantasy football world thinks that it was Brian Robinson that was holding Antonio Gibson back. Now he definitely was. But don't forget about J.D. McKissick. Gibson saw a double-digit percentage target share in just 2 of 11 games last year when J.D. McKissick was active. When he wasn't active, he hit it in 3 of 5 games. Gibson had 5 top 10 weekly PPR performances at running back last year. 3 of those 5 came in the 5 games without J.D. McKissick. But the reason I'm not just full-blown selling him right now is because of Washington's early season schedule. The Commanders get the Jags and then they get the Lions. They're actually favorites in both of those games, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. So there's less of a chance that McKissick is heavily involved in those contests. If you have a neutral or positive game script, we will see more Antonio Gibson. You can absolutely sell right now, but I would also consider waiting until after week 2. Add Jahan Dotson. So speaking of that Washington schedule, the passing attack is also going to benefit. According to Pro Football Focus, Jacksonville has the 19th ranked secondary entering the year. Detroit's at 25. So enter Jahan Dotson. He's been consistently playing with the first team offense this offseason, and he should have a role immediately, probably in the slot. My prospect model rated Dotson in the 94th percentile. It's just that he's being overshadowed by these other really good wide receivers from this class. But make no mistake, Jahan Dotson is very good. And he's still available in 79% of Yahoo leagues, so go at him. Sell Najee Harris. So last week, I brought up Najee Harris on the Risers and Fallers episode. And it wasn't because he was moving in the right direction. Harris ended up being someone who wasn't on a ton of my fantasy teams this year. I do think the volume's obviously going to be there, and we should be chasing volume in fantasy football. But there's also a lot of volume for the other running backs that were being drafted around him. And I do think that Najee Harris is likely to see less work this year than what he saw last year. Since 2011, we've seen 79 running backs hit 20 plus touches per game while playing 8 or more games in a season. And that's receptions plus attempts. Of those 79, 61 have next season data where they continue to play at least 8 games. So we're looking at 61 running backs who had 20 plus touches one season, and then the following season, they played 8 games. They were active. Just 42.6% of those running backs hit 20 touches per game the following year, and only 14 of the 61 improved on that number. So chances are Harris, who was at 22.4 touches last year, he won't hit that mark this year. And I've mentioned this before, but I think a lot of this could be driven by his receiving numbers. Ben Roethlisberger is no longer the quarterback for the Steelers. They're going to have a more mobile passer under center, whether it's Mitch Trubisky or whether it's Kenny Pickett. That could lead to fewer dump-offs. And last year, Najee Harris, according to PFF, he led the NFL in targets behind the line of scrimmage. And he's now coming off this Liz Frank injury. And the Steelers have one of the worst offensive lines in football. I don't think that he's incapable of being like a high-end RB2 or even a low-end RB1. My fear is the ceiling. He's going to see a lot of work, but a running back still needs to have a lot of scoring opportunities, and he needs to see a lot of work through the air in order to be a true top 3 running back. There are other guys you can get for Najee Harris right now who have a better range of outcomes than he does. Add Romeo Doubs. Now look, I know that a lot of you guys have been drafting best ball teams all summer like I have, and we've seen the rise of Romeo Doubs. He went from someone that no one was really talking about during draft time to a potential high target option in this Packers offense. So it might have been weird to hear me say that he's an ad. But here's the thing, over on Yahoo, he's only rostered in 32% of leagues. That means that of the people listening to this show right now, he's sitting on a lot of waiver wires in your leagues. Look at the Packers' wide receiver landscape. Look at their pass catching landscape. They don't have any secure weapons there. Christian Watson was hurt during camp and he's a raw prospect. Allen Lazard is an unproven alpha. Sammy Watkins and Randall Cobb are way past their prime. And Doubs was an underrated prospect. He had a positive draft capital delta in my model. And I think that he can take on that Marquez Valdez-Scantling role right away. Pro Football Focus data said that Doubs ranked in the top 30 in deep ball yards and receptions last year in college football, and in 2020, he was third in deep ball yards, only behind Devontae Smith and De'Ami Brown. My model does like Christian Watson more than Romeo Doubs, but it's because of draft capital. I would not be shocked if Doubs ends up being the better player. And there's a chance right now, at the time of this recording, that Allen Lazard doesn't suit up this weekend. And that would give Doubs even more of a boost. Buy the Denver Broncos offense. So we've got Russell Wilson leading the Broncos offense now, as we all know. This transaction's pretty straightforward as a result. Not only could Denver's offense just be really good all season long, but they're going to start the year off probably pretty hot because they get the Seahawks and then the Texans. So all Broncos players are in play, at least to trade for. I do think the one player that's probably most interesting from this team early in the season, though, is Melvin Gordon. He's not someone that I'm necessarily wanting to rely on all season because we know the upside's really, really capped by Javonte Williams. But Denver has the most favorable combined point spread of any team in the league during weeks 1 and 2. So even if we see Williams capture a bigger backfield share this year, Gordon could get a decent number of touches to start the season because Denver would be in positive game scripts. So maybe you could consider this a Melvin Gordon transaction. I just wouldn't go overboard because he's not someone I really want to rely on week in and week out. It's just that to start the season, they have really favorable matchups. Add Zamir White. I was pretty surprised that Zamir White's roster percentage over on Yahoo is actually pretty low. But every sign points to the Raiders using a backfield committee like we saw with Josh McDaniels in New England. I don't think Josh Jacobs is going to see the workload that he saw last year. We're going to probably see Amir Abdullah be a pass catching back for them, and then Zamir White share work on early downs. So I do think that Abdullah is a decent add in deeper PPR leagues. But Zamir White's really intriguing because he's a very intriguing prospect. He shared a backfield with James Cook in college. James Cook, a great pass catching back, that limited Zamir White for sure. But so did injury. That's part of the reason why Zamir White did not look good in my prospect model. He didn't have a complete production profile. But he was a 5-star recruit out of high school, and he has a really impressive size-speed combo. His weight-adjusted 40-yard dash time placed him about the 95th percentile at the running back position. Jacobs is on his last year of his contract, and the Raiders didn't get him with that 5th-year option. There's a chance that Vegas slowly phases him out of that offense. And if they do that, Zamir White is absolutely going to benefit. Sell Rashaad Penny. I almost feel like I'm on an island with the way that I'm viewing Rashaad Penny. And that's even more so now because Kenneth Walker's banged up. But there's a lot not to like about Rashaad Penny. His injury history is definitely worrisome. He's played 37 games across his 4-year career. He's hit 15 or more carries in just 5 games. Now, he helped us win a lot of fantasy championships last year, and I'm very grateful for that. But his production during that stretch was not sustainable. He averaged 6.3 yards per carry, and he saw 8 total targets. 8. That's it. His highest single game target share last season was 10.7%. And yeah, like I just said, he had some amazing production down the stretch last year. Over Seattle's final 5 games in 2021, Penny had 4 top 10 PPR performances at the running back position. But guys, Seattle was 3-2 during that stretch. I feel like that gets lost sometimes. Entering 2022, they don't have Russell Wilson. They're projected to be one of the worst teams in football. So if we don't see a lot of pass catching upside for Penny, are we expecting Seattle to be a lot better than advertised? Are we thinking that he's going to maintain his yards per carry pace? Why would we make those assumptions? The Seahawks are pretty big underdogs in each of their first 2 games this year too, before they get Atlanta in week 3. There is a worry that Rashaad Penny gets game scripted out of those games. And the reason why I'm bringing him up right now is because you might be able to sell him with this Kenneth Walker injury. Because it's so up in the air. We have no idea what's going on with Walker. But if and when Walker's back, we're looking at a split backfield within a very bad offense. It's really hard for me to buy into that. Add Alec Pierce. So my prospect model did not like Alec Pierce a whole lot, but I'm warming up to him, and I have been the last couple of months. Athleticism itself is typically overrated at wide receiver. It can't hurt to be athletic, but production is more important analytically. And Alec Pierce didn't have a great production profile. He had a fine enough breakout age, but he was below average in the 3 main production metrics that my model uses. And he wasn't an early declare either. But keep in mind, sometimes athleticism translates. We saw that to some degree a couple of years ago with Chase Claypool. And in your season-long league, the cost to acquire Pierce is absolutely nothing. He's rostered in only 8% of Yahoo leagues right now. This is not a dynasty take. In redraft, these are fine bets to make because he has a legitimate shot to be the Colts' number 2 option this year. Buy Kadarius Toney. We've seen Kadarius Toney's ADP drop a little bit over the last month because of this injury that he's been dealing with his leg and his knee. Basically his everything. And maybe this is who he is. Maybe Kadarius Toney is just a guy who's always going to be on the injury report. Because remember, he was banged up last year too. But I'm still willing to buy into him. Because his rookie season was really underrated. Since 2011, we've seen over 100 rookie wide receivers hit 50-plus targets during that first year. Among those players, Toney's targets per route run rate ranks second best behind only Tyreek Hill. So when Toney was on the field, he was getting a lot of looks. And only 7 of those wide receivers had a better yards per route run rate than Toney. And you could argue that yards per route run for rookie wide receivers is one of the more predictive metrics that you can find. And then obviously, like I talked about in the breakout wide receivers episode, second-year wide receivers in the middle rounds break out at an obscene rate. That's exactly what Kadarius Toney is. Situationally, things could be a lot better for Toney, but you are sort of getting an injury discount on him right now. In the end, buying talent at wide receiver is never a bad idea. Add Gerald Everett. It's tough to find late-round breakout tight ends. But one of the things that I've found by analyzing historical ADP is that late round tight ends who have top 5 quarterbacks by ADP, they break out at a pretty decent rate. It's what got me onto Dawson Knox last year and Dalton Schultz to some degree. And then in 2019, we had Austin Hooper. Gerald Everett fits that mold this season. And he's got some historical production to back up the idea that he's not a bad pass-catching tight end. So if you punted the position or you just want a little bit more depth at the position, he makes some sense. And he's still available in 77% of Yahoo leagues. Buy Tony Pollard. You guys are probably sick of me talking about Pollard because I've been talking about him all offseason. He's been drafted around his projection. And that might seem reasonable. But that projection assumes that Ezekiel Elliott is healthy. If Zeke gets hurt, Pollard becomes a potential RB1 in fantasy football. We can sit here and talk about how the Cowboys might use Pollard a little bit more at wide receiver. Or we can sit here and talk about how team RB2s by ADP, who get drafted in the middle rounds, who then have teammate RB1s in the running back dead zone, how those RB2s break out at really good rates historically. We can talk about how Tony Pollard's been one of the most efficient running backs in football of late. And we can also talk about that over the first couple of weeks of the season, Dallas gets Tampa Bay and Cincinnati, 2 potential shootouts. But I really want to just go back to that very simple baseline. People have been valuing Tony Pollard at his projection. We shouldn't do that for players who have contingent upside like he has. Add the Cincinnati Bengals defense. So the Bengals get the Steelers in week 1. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, they're 6.5-point favorites. Now, Pittsburgh's been decent at allowing sacks the last couple of years, but it's not because their offensive line is good. It's because with Ben Roethlisberger, they just got rid of the ball really quick. He hated taking sacks. That's likely to change with whoever's under center for Pittsburgh. So since he should play with a positive game script offensively, they're at home. To me, they're an obvious streaming choice. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Make sure to check out LateRound.com. Right now, the big thing that's happening over there is the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon, where I'm providing weekly rankings and start-sit help. And there's an awesome Discord community that's been built up too. It's really an awesome group of people. So you can join that by just heading to LateRound.com and clicking Patreon. Thanks for listening, everyone. Really appreciate it. I'll be back tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends episode.